This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It's 3 minutes after 10. A very good morning to you. I don't do this perhaps as often as I should, but I do it more than I used to. What on earth is he talking about? You're thinking, is he allowed to behave like that in a studio? I'm referring to conversations about the climate crisis, which in a completely honest universe, a completely objective universe, a universe where we didn't reflect upon how we feel about things, but simply reported what we should care most about, we would probably be discussing every day. But we don't. And I want to know why. The world is on track for a, quote, hellish 3 degrees centigrade of global heating, the United Nations has warned, before the crucial COP28 climate summit that begins next week in the United Arab Emirates. It also looks at the actions, or we will also look at the actions of the wealthiest people on the planet when it comes to things like holidays and meals out, contributing to a carbon footprint that dwarfs that of less wealthy people. I just list the stuff that's popped into my head this week. There's also a report, I think it was CNN, certainly one big broadcaster has sort of closed down its climate change desk. I don't know whether that's because they're elevating it and promoting it to a higher status, but it certainly looks as though they're demoting it as an area of news. And if you're doing it according to clicks, this is the maddest thing, I think, about my profession's relationship with climate change. It doesn't sell tickets. It simply doesn't put bums on seats. It doesn't collect clicks. I presume you've noticed how cynical this profession has become. The pursuit of clicks. We're all right because we generally get clicks on this programme for doing the work of the good and the just, even if it sometimes involves beating up people who are a bit unpleasant or a bit slow on the uptake. But the pursuit of clicks, you know, I could, if I was prioritizing social media clicks over integrity, honesty, and the most basic journalistic principles, then you could make a list right now of the kind of people I'd be inviting onto the program. You don't need me to tell you who does that, who actually behaves in a completely unprincipled way in the desperate pursuit of clicks, by getting people onto their programs who, frankly, shouldn't really have any platform at all in polite society or in public. Look where it's led us. Look, we're treating people like Donald Trump and Nigel Farage as if they're honest contributors to public discourse. Look where it's left us. So my industry pursues clicks. And the climate doesn't deliver them, which is really, really odd, because you can terrify somebody. You know, your Auntie Doris is... I've stopped using Doris after a very valid complaint from an actual Doris. I've stopped using Auntie Doris's Facebook page as a figure of speech. I'll stick with Uncle Keith's Facebook page. You know how easy it is to terrify and enrage people about things that aren't actually happening. You know, the immigrants who are going to steal your job and your biscuits, whatever it may be, the unemployed, disabled people who are responsible for the country's economic woes, the single mothers who, if only we could get rid of them, we'd all be really rich, like lottery winners. You know how easy it is, right? The woke mob. Can't name any members of it, but down with that sort of thing. It's so easy to enrage and enfeeble people with false information. And yet, the true information, the factual information... I'm just going to open Idiot's Corner a bit earlier this morning. Andy's been in touch. He says, there is no climate emergency. It's the biggest hoax of all time. Thank God the majority knows this is a hoax. Talk to people outside your bubble, and I am telling the truth. People do not believe there is an emergency. Until Galileo came along, people didn't believe that the Earth revolved around the sun. They thought it was the other way around. Andy would have been texting then about how it's a massive hoax. Heliocentrism is just a massive hoax. Everybody knows. Get out of your bubble. Speak to people who actually have boiled ham between their ears, and they will tell you what's real. I mean, it's just such an odd position to take, and it is irrelevant to the conversation that I'm having. So to be absolutely clear, at 8 minutes after 10, and apologies in advance for the arrogance, I'm not talking to idiots like Andy today. Idiot's Corner exists for a reason, and today it's like a microchip activated cat flap. So Andy's got a little chip in his head, and he can get into the cat flap, he can get through it, but he can't get out again. So Idiot's Corner today has a one-way entrance and no exit. I'm not interested in talking to idiots about this. I'm interested in talking to people who know that they should care more, but don't know why they don't. Actually, that excludes people who do care enough. Because the other story that I haven't mentioned yet involves the United Nations complaining about the jailing, the severity of the sentences handed down to a pair of climate change protesters, in this case, Just Stop Oil protesters. Rishi Sunak, you can read this story, you could almost write it yourself. Rishi Sunak has rejected claims from the United Nations that lengthy jail sentences for climate activists could stifle free speech in the UK. Rishi Sunak is an idiot. He can go and join Andy behind the cat flap. Because, of course, lengthy jail sentences will stifle free speech. Whether you think that's a good thing or not is moot. If you're going to be sent to jail for 3 years for climbing up a bridge, scaling the Dartford crossing, then the people behind you are less likely to do it. They will become martyrs, some of them. They will embrace the opportunity of incarceration because it proves the strength of their principles. Or perhaps it feeds an attention-seeking gene. But the bottom line is, if I was minded to protest about climate change in a really noticeable way, and you have to do increasingly impactful things to get noticed, that's another mad thing about my profession. How many times have you heard people who never talk about the climate change complaining about the fact that they're talking about it today because people have undertaken a mode of protest that attracts the sort of attention that peaceful protest never does? Oh, it's outrageous, they're blocking the roads. I've never talked about climate change in a level-headed way, but today I'm going to get really cross about the people who are protesting against it or trying to draw attention to it. So it works. And if you jail people for 3 years for doing things that work, they become less likely to do it, I think. So, of course, it's stifling free speech. And, of course, Rishi Sunak has rejected claims. Perhaps they could pass a law, like the Rwanda legislation that they're planning. Just pass a law to make the things that you want to be true superficially true. Rishi Sunak's latest bill is designed to make him 6'4". I don't know if you've seen this. Have you seen this? He's passing a bill. Parliament is going to vote on how tall Rishi Sunak is. And the Conservative government is putting forward a proposal that Rishi Sunak is actually 6'4". They're expecting it to pass as a 3-line whip. And come tea time tomorrow, Rishi Sunak will officially and legally and constitutionally be 6'4". And Rwanda will be a safe country. And jailing people for protesting against climate change will not stifle their freedom of speech. All of those things will become true by 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock tomorrow. Who even knows what time it will be? Because they're going to pass another law. We're going to throw away all the clocks. We're going to call it Rishi time. It's 4:00 Rishi. It's Rishi o'clock. Get rid of the clocks. Get rid of the time. Get rid of everything that you know to be true and replace it with things that you know to be false, but you are compelled and required to insist that they are true. Rishi Sunak is 6'4", and Rwanda is a safe country. And there's no such thing as climate change. Just to keep an eye on old Andy there in Idiot's Corner. All right, mate. Do you want a biscuit? There you go. And then we come to me, as we always do, and I am aware of that, and I sense that it may be slightly irritating sometimes, but I think today I'm going to be completely honest with you. I don't care enough. I still don't care enough. I say that, and I feel my... I'm not going to say, but it's not that my buttocks are clenching. Nobody wants to know that. I just feel a sort of sense of shame kick in. I don't want to tell you this. Actually, I still don't care enough. I still don't care enough. And I don't know why, because I'm not thick. I understand. I'm not Andy. I know that if 90-odd% of the world's scientists can prove something to be true, then it's true. I'm not dangerous. I'm not sticking my head in the sand. I've made changes in my own life, not big ones, but, well, quite big ones, but not earth-shattering ones. I used to get a car to work every day. I used to be driven to work every day, as is befitting of a broadcaster of my status and reputation and renown. Now I don't. I get a bus and a train, a bus and a tube to work. In fact, I got a bus earlier this week that had my own face on the side. Do you know that if you have your face on the side of a bus, there is absolutely no special treatment as a passenger when you get on it? So people don't even notice. How annoyed with me would you be if I told you that I wanted to tell other people at the bus stop. Because I travel quite incognito. I like to wear a big hat, a nice woolly hat. And sometimes I have my hood up. But I'm standing at the bus stop and the bus comes to a halt by the bus stop. And there's my face on the side of the bus. I think people would find that quite amusing if I were to go to you. If you were standing next to a bloke at the bus stop, right? And he kind of nudged you gently and said, look, and then smiled at you in a slightly vacant way, you'd be it's a notable moment, right? There's a bloke, I don't believe it. There's a bloke on the side of a bus and I'm standing next to him at the bus stop. That's just interesting, right? But I don't do it because I'm on this constant quest to be less conceited. And I mention that because today I am making it all about me. I don't know why I don't care more. I don't know why I don't care more. So, Sunak's rejecting claims that prison sentences for exercising free speech stifle free speech. The world is facing a 3-degree rise in climate heating. This is the mad stuff, by the way. This is the Don't Look Up stuff, that brilliant Leonardo DiCaprio film. This is the point where, you know, records are being obliterated. Heat waves, floods. I don't know if you saw the Taylor Swift story from Brazil earlier this week. One poor woman died. Taylor Swift herself appeared to be short of breath on stage in Rio de Janeiro. The costs, financial and logistical, of calling off a concert because you're in the middle of an apocalyptic heat wave are so high that it went ahead. There is, says the executive director of the United Nations Agency, the Environment Programme, there is no person or economy left on the planet untouched by climate change. So we need to stop setting unwanted records on emissions, temperature, and extreme weather. So that's 2 stories. Sunak rejects the claim that getting jailed for exercising your free speech about climate change might stifle free speech in the future. The United Nations warns of a hellish increase in climate heating. The CNN, I think it's CNN, forgive me if I've misremembered that, CNN are closing down their climate change desk because even when you're in the business of reporting reality, some elements of reality just don't sell. I'm going to circle back to that point, I suspect. They just don't sell. It proves my point. I have failed in many ways to make this topic as urgent and as interesting as it should be. And I don't understand why I've failed. I am quite good at this. I can make you care about things by 10:30 that you didn't care about at 10 o'clock. I can make you care less about things if somebody else has spent the morning encouraging you to be hateful towards the unemployed or the disabled or foreigners or refugees. Then by 10:30, I can lance that boil. I can remove the pus that has been injected into your bloodstream by right-wing media. I'm quite good at that, but I can't do this. I can't do this. Maybe it's because the richest 1% of humanity is responsible for more carbon emissions than the poorest 66%. And I'm in the 1%. I don't know why. And nor do you. But I'm going to ask you anyway. Why don't I care more? Why don't I care enough? Why do I read about an international broadcaster shutting down its climate change desk and think, yeah, fair enough. I know why they've done that. Why aren't I climbing the walls, or indeed the Dartford crossing, in exasperation and outrage? Why am I tempted, as the metaphorical meteor makes its way towards our planet, why am I tempted not to look up anymore? Why is that? It's nothing to do, just to save you tuppence ringing in, it's nothing to do, I don't believe, with the secretly funded lobby dedicated to promoting the interests of fossil fuels and denying the existence of climate change. My new book nearly ended. It's the CNBC desk. Thank you, Venky, not the CNN desk. But same point. I mean, it is absolutely remarkable to think that they've shut it down. Anyway, it's 18 after 10, so hold that thought. Why? Why don't I care enough? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
21 minutes after 10 is the time. By all the laws of logic and by almost every other example in my own life, I should be halfway up the Dartford crossing at the moment. I should be screaming from the rooftops. I should be gluing myself to the road outside Charing Cross Station. So why aren't I? I know how bad things are. And yet, even with this platform that I have the privilege of sharing with you every single day, it's like the dots are not connected on anything like the scale that they should be. Why not? James is in Exeter to kick things off. James, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James. I think there's a number of points here. I think, first of all, the mainstream media are failing in their duty to report the seriousness of the crisis to their viewers, readers and listeners.
Yes, true. That's chicken and egg in a way, isn't it? Because I'm sitting here as a member of the mainstream media telling you that I don't do enough, but that I know that I should do more. But don't forget the cold, hard, cynical calculation that it doesn't... I mean, Yaman's in charge of the clips today. He'll put something up. I'll tell you what he sent me. He sent me a little clip of me saying, why don't I care enough? And it won't come close to being the biggest seller of the week. So it's chicken and egg. It's not the media's fault. It's your fault for not caring enough.
Yeah, exactly. I spent time in prison. I'm a Paralympic athlete. I climbed on top of a plane and glued myself to the top of a city airport back in 1929 as part of an Extinction Rebellion protest.
Crikey.
I went to prison for that. I was given a year's sentence at Wandsworth. It was overturned by the Court of Appeal. But I received about 2,000 items of correspondence during my time in prison. And I'm registered blind. The prison wouldn't allow me my glasses to read the items of mail, so my cellmate did it for me.
You're James Brown.
Yes. So it was a lot of reading. But the real strong message that came through from a vast majority of those letters and emails and so on was that people just feel they don't know what to do. They feel powerless, even with the full awareness of the severity of the crisis. They just feel that they can't do anything. They feel impotent. And the question of, well, does climbing the Dartford Bridge or gluing yourself to the roof of a plane help? The fact is we don't know, and we have to be comfortable and reconcile ourselves with that uncertainty. And I wrote about this when I was in prison, and it's we just don't know. But
what happened to you? What happened to you? Because you're let me just do the calculation. You're about 61 now.
59.
59. It says here you were 57 in 2019. You need to get your publicist onto this, unless you managed to slow down time.
Let's not quibble over the little details.
No, I know. But what happened to you? Because when you were 17 and 27 and 30, what happened? Why did you become the bloke that glued himself to a plane?
I was blissfully unaware of the crisis until my daughter sat me down and told me about the birds and the bees, literally.
Yeah.
She told me about the severity of the crisis. She was studying geography and environment at university at the time. And I met her one day for coffee, and I just knew everything wasn't right. And she told me the extent of the crisis. And I was just so unaware.
What did she think? And this is an important question. It's not just me being gossipy. What did she think when you glued yourself to a plane and got sent to jail? Tell me the truth. Tell me the truth.
Mixed feelings. I mean, those who were watching the live stream thought I might die, including my wife.
Yikes.
It was. I mean, it was a risky thing to do. And my daughter, I guess she understands, and I would say to an extent follows the sort of the theory of change that says that all the big societal changes that have happened throughout history have happened as a result of non-violent direct action. So, she understands the theory of change, but of course she was terrified to see what I was doing, and it was pretty inevitable that a prison sentence was
But that's the interesting point in a way, isn't it? Is that she was your inspiration to go further than she wanted you to go.
Yeah, maybe that's what.
So that's the crux. That's the pivot of this conversation. Why do you care enough?
Yeah.
Or so much when even your daughter, who cares as much but won't act as impactfully?
Well, she did act. She and I were amongst two of the first people to step onto the bridges when Extinction Rebellion launched at the end of 2018. We walked arm in arm in absolute tears. We didn't want to be doing that.
There's so little space between you and ambivalence, isn't there? People are either signed up like you are, or idiots denying science, and that's a tiny minority with a hugely disproportionate voice. But most people, I believe, recognise the reality of what you're describing and yet are a million miles away from following you down the path you've gone down. That's the bit I don't understand.
I don't understand it, but I think that maybe an element of it is that they simply don't know what they can do. They look at the activists and say, well, are those guys doing the right thing? Yeah. It's not an easy life. I felt absolutely full of shame when I was convicted. Yes. And it's a real tough path to follow, and not everybody does it. And the other thing that people wrote to me about when I was in prison was to acknowledge what they saw as courage in me. And I've spent a lifetime as an athlete, and I've done a lot of risky things, so I didn't see climbing on a plane as being risky, or courageous. I just thought it was something that had to be done. So, I think there's those two elements to it, probably.
And there it is. And it's worth mentioning, because we talked about this yesterday in the context of COVID policy, that the cost-benefit analysis, James gets sent to jail for costing an airline an estimated £40,000. And he sees himself as correctly trying to draw attention to an apocalyptic existential crisis that humanity is facing. But it cost an airline £40,000, so he got sent to jail. Somewhere in that story is perhaps the beginning of an answer to the question of why we don't care more, the disproportionate nature of coverage and reporting, but it's not the whole answer. James, take care. Rachel's in Kendal, in Cumbria. Rachel, hello. What would you like to say?
How are you doing? It was amazing to hear from James, and I really, what he says really resonates with me, because I've been involved with XR and a little bit of JSO, but never been arrested, never put myself in that position. And I am so scared of it. Yes. I know that the climate change and the climate disaster that is coming closer to us every day. We're going to hit. We've hit 1.5. We're going to hit 2 degrees. Our future, the future of my children, are really tenuous. And yet every day I go to work, and yet every day I don't glue myself to things, and yet every day I don't act. And I'm a psychologist, and I think it's because I am protecting my brain by
Go on, tell me more.
Thinking about the instant moment. So tomorrow, I need to get my kids to school. I need to make sure that they have food on the table tomorrow. I'm not thinking about in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. We're instant gratification. Humans live day to day. We're not very good at thinking long term at all. And capitalism, that's a huge factor. I'm worried about how much money I earn and if I'm going to be able to pay my mortgage and things like that. And if I go to prison, then what happens? Will I be thrown out of
I'm not necessarily
all these kind of things.
Asking why we aren't all gluing ourselves to planes. Mm-hmm. And I don't think you're in the category of not caring enough. You do care enough. You don't, but you don't think you do enough. That's a different problem from mine.
No.
I don't care enough.
You don't care enough. Why don't you care enough?
Well, hang on a minute. It's my phone in. That's the question I've been asking since 10 o'clock this morning, Rachel. Logically, I do. It's the difference between head and heart. Intellectually, I do. Emotionally, I don't. Why is that?
It's a disconnect, isn't it? You're not really connecting with the information you're given. You're protecting your own emotions. Maybe you can't deal with the emotions that are involved.
Could be that. That speaks a psychologist. Whereas you do know and you do care, but you don't do enough about it for similar reasons of self-protection. Yeah.
And we need strong leadership to move us forward with this. We can't have the Conservatives and Rishi Sunak pull back on all of these things that we need to move forward on and damage any movement that's been made. We need to have a focus on the future of Britain and the future of the world and the future of all the species and the ecosystems that are going to be damaged by this climate disaster that's coming towards us so quickly. We all need to act, and we all need to tune into that and actually shout, but we need to feel that we're going to be listened to, because that's what James was saying. He was saying he didn't know if it was going to make a difference. He sacrificed so much and did what he did, and
but what did he achieve?
Impactful. I think, people know his name. They know what he did. They know that
he's on the record,
famous person, and that's really important. That famous people in the media who are known and spoken about, Emma Thompson and all these people who do kind of stand up for Greenpeace and march with them. Their faces are are more listened. Their voices and faces are more recognised and listened to.
But there's a lead. I hear you, and I don't disagree with you. But there is. I don't think it's idiot's corner territory to point out that the richest 1% of humanity is responsible for more carbon emissions than the poorest 66%. So I do understand. I don't mean the sort of lazy Daily Mail nonsense about how dare Prince Harry get in an aeroplane or catch a private jet when he also cares about the environment. He's such a hypocrite. I don't mean that lazy level, but on a deeper level, on a more intelligent level, there is something hypocritical about the people you've just described taking the lead when they come from a cohort of humanity that is responsible for more carbon emissions than the poorest 66% of people on the planet.
But then they're the ones that need to act.
But they're the ones with the platform. So who else is going to have? Exactly. If you haven't got a platform, you have to glue yourself to a plane.
Exactly. And that is what has to, that's what, I know lots of people who've ended up in prison for doing amazing acts of, increasing climate awareness. And they are fantastic and they do so much, but they are not seen in the way that...
And they're never going to be. And there it is. There is the question. Why did you do that? Why did you glue yourself to a plane? Why did you climb the Dartford crossing? Because I can. And I don't have a platform of anything like sufficient scale to make these points in a way that doesn't involve breaking the law and compromising my own liberty. Thank you, Rachel. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:36 is the time, and it's the weirdest question I ever ask you. It's a bit self-referential, but it's sincere. Why? Why did people who understand, myself included, the severity of the climate crisis, the urgency of the need for change, not feel it more deeply? Quite often when we have this conversation, or variations of it, you send me a reference to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm not sure it works as well as you think it does. If you don't know what Maslow posited, it's a sort of pyramid of priorities, the things that you need to have in place before you can start caring about other things. So it starts with physiological needs, breathing, air, food, water, shelter, clothing, sleep, the things that will kill you if you don't have them, or at least severely compromise your existence. And once you've got those in place, you can move on to what he calls safety and security, and that would be health, employment, property, family, and social ability. But I wonder where the climate crisis would sit on this. Would it not sit in safety? And well, I suppose it's in the short term, isn't it? It's in the now. It's in the moment. Have I got food? Yes, right. Am I safe? Yes, right. Then you move on to love and belonging. It's the third priority, working up from necessity. Love and belonging. So that's friendship, family, a sense of connection. I think we give that to each other on this show, actually, if I was going to get soppy for a minute. Obviously, you'd be getting it from other areas as well, ideally, but I think most mornings we probably get a sense of friendship, family, intimacy, a sense of connection from each other on the radio. I do, anyway. And then self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, the need to be a unique individual. I suspect a lot of people don't get there. They're too busy. They're expending so much energy on the first three, the physiological needs, the safety and security, the love and belonging. You don't find the time to focus on self-esteem, to focus on respect of others, or the need to be a unique individual, the temptation to be part of a faceless herd, ranting and raving about whatever it is you've been invited to rant and rave about today is almost irresistible. And then finally, self-actualization, or to use a modern description of that, being woke. Because self-actualization involves morality, creativity, spontaneity, acceptance, purpose, meaning, inner potential. Being bigger than you are, in a way. Being dedicated to things other than your own atavistic needs, your own base appetites. Being dedicated to the pursuit of good, as it were, or the greater good. So where does the climate fit in on any of that? Because it's a safety and security issue, but it's somehow too distant. It's a love and belonging issue, but it doesn't feel like that. It's not really a self-esteem issue, although it should be. Respect of others should entail protection of planet. And then self-actualization, morality, purpose, all of those things. Maybe it is just a self-actualization issue, because that's why the question today is personal. Why don't I care more? Why don't I care enough? 10:40 is the time. Nick's in Crystal Palace. Nick, what would you like to say?
Well, James, first of all, thank you so much for being so brave and generous.
It's not brave, it's honest.
Like me to,
thank you, but I appreciate that, but I'm not going to take that compliment today. Cheers, though.
I would say one of the things is I think you actually care more than you might think or feel that you do, which is why you're even asking this question in the first place.
Maybe.
But the reason why that just sort of doesn't land, as you would say,
yes,
there are many reasons, and I do think I'm so glad that you talked about self-actualization and recognition amongst people, because that has a tremendous amount to do with it. There's two basic, I think, general categories of reasons why you, or even I sometimes might not care enough. We, on one hand, the simplest of those to talk about is that the reality is just so awful. We would rather awful realities like this be negotiable, but they unfortunately are objective. And so our beliefs sometimes get in the way of actualizing an eco-cultural identification with ourselves, because it's just such a tremendously hard thing to do, especially if you think you have to do it all by yourself. And unfortunately, our politics nowadays are very different from when I was growing up, even as lately as the 90s in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm partly from in the U.S. There was a tremendous upswelling of ecological consciousness and activism.
There was, wasn't there?
Yeah, and it got chilled.
Why?
Very, very, so many different things happened. Sociocultural priorities got in the way of ecocultural priorities.
Okay.
Basically.
But that's a hierarchy of needs, isn't it, essentially?
I don't think the hierarchy of needs, it is. But
no, a hierarchy, not necessarily Maslow's, or a hierarchy of focus, interest.
Yeah, hierarchy of momentary focus, because you have to remember any of these hierarchies are going to be massively subjective.
Yes, of course.
There's no objective hierarchy. It's going to depend on where you're from and what your situation is. But I don't think it has as much to do with how much money you make.
No.
It may have to do with class in another sense, in that, there are things that certain respectable people of certain descriptions aren't allowed to care about, and other people who have a little bit more leeway. But so that's one half of it that I spoke of. The other half is a lot more deeper, historical, anthropological, sociological. Basically, for about 200 years, our culture, our sort of collective philosophy, groupthink, has been to separate nature from culture. You've got culture over here on the human side and nature over there everywhere else, and it's very easy to sort of relegate the non-human to the background. The non-human environment is a background stage, and of course it becomes psychologically very comfortable to think in those terms. I mean, this is the psychology of self-protection again, isn't it? Is I don't want to go there because it's too terrifying. And if you do go there, you end up gluing yourself to a plane. It's too terrifying, and also politically, we've become much more atomized and much more socio-culturally identified, and we're so busy clinging on to our socio-cultural identities that we can't envision the communalist social movement that's going to make acting against climate change easier for us all on an individual level.
And so that boils down to, what's the point of me doing recycling when yada yada China yada, or what? I mean, it is looking for the excuse not to do anything.
Or not just China, my neighbor.
No, well, exactly, yes. Or
it's everybody.
Prince Harry.
If we had more of a collective culture of ecological consciousness, something like what you would have in a union, a trade union mentality,
collective bargaining.
Of course, we're all collective bargaining. Of course, collective ecology. Of course, we're all going to strike together. Of course, we're not going to let so it's bystander
effect as well. God, we're dropping the psychological references very liberally this morning, but it's a bit of bystander effect as well. If someone goes first and manages, like Greta Thunberg, I suppose, she can she can motivate and inspire behaviour that people wouldn't have undertaken independently or in her absence.
And in order to understand better why you might not care as much as you want to, the fact that you want to means that you kind of do. But the reason why you might not as much as you want to might better be answered if we focus on why does Greta Thunberg doesn't have to do this.
No, of course not.
She, and I didn't have to spend my undergrad studying ecological agriculture. I didn't have to come all the way to London to study ecology, culture, and society in a master's program. It wasn't just that I could. I had to borrow money heavily to do this. Yeah. All this stuff is, well, I felt like, for me, it was like I couldn't. I couldn't not do anything. You couldn't not. I just wasn't interested in anything else enough.
And there it is. That's the urgency that you either get or you don't get. And even if you understand, you don't feel that urgency. And it is a feeling. It's a feeling built upon rational understanding. It's not a sort of random emotional dopamine hit. It is genuine, intellectually sound reasoning. But two people can have the same intellectually sound reasoning. One of them feels Nick's sense of urgency, or Greta Thunberg's sense of urgency, and another one, the majority of us, don't. It's weird. It's genuinely weird. It's 10:46.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 to 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Full coverage coming up of the autumn statement, about which we don't know much yet, except we can say with some certainty that the metropolitan Liberal elite will come out of Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement better off than they went into it. And if you're tempted ever to buy into the idea that metropolitan Liberal elite is a pejorative, or that the Conservative Party is somehow an enemy of these people, then you probably should ask yourself, why do they keep giving us money? Why has there never been a Tory budget that doesn't leave me better off than I was before? Liz Truss's budget, if it had come into effect, would have been like a scratch card for me, a winning scratch card. So why is that? It's weird, isn't it? Because if we talk about immigration or refugees, then there is a temptation among many people to think, oh, God, they don't know what they're talking about. They're so out of touch. And they prey on you. They prey on that. They want you to... And yet when it comes around to budget time, they give all the money to people like me. It's weird. Maybe I'll be wrong this time. Maybe I'll come out of a Tory budget or a Tory autumn statement worse off than I went into it, but it's not happened yet. It's never happened in 13 years of sitting behind this microphone under a Tory government. It's never happened. I've never come out. Well, just think about that. Think about that. Because it's very woke, isn't it, to think that you deserve money more than I do, if you're presuming that, people who are less well off than me deserve the money more than I do. And yet up pops Jeremy Hunt to slips it into my back pocket. Here you go, mate. Buy yourself something nice. Treacle. It's weird, isn't it? I wonder if you've spotted that before. So next time you find yourself listening to someone or reading someone who claims to be right-wing, bewailing the metropolitan elite, ask them why their political masters are always giving money to the metropolitan elite and not, for example, to the Red Wall or whatever you prefer to call it. 10:52 is the time. Why don't we care more about the environment? Why don't we care enough? What is it? What is it? Clive's in Canterbury. Clive, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Look, actually mentioning Jeremy Hunt in the autumn statement is a great place to start, because if Jeremy Hunt and his colleagues would understand that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, we might get somewhere. Where I was going to start is that your previous caller started to move from the personal to the collective.
Yes.
And I think we are largely sort of force-fed, obviously through the media, but by and large because of the leadership and actually lack of political will to grasp the problem. Now, some of this goes back to something that's actually been raised this week in the COVID inquiry. Our political masters lack basic scientific understanding. That was mentioned about, obviously, our last leader, but one. Yes. We've just had a foreign secretary who famously said we can now cut the green crap. Yes. That actually can be expanded to the sort of the global field. I worked with a brilliant academic about 20 years ago who actually put together data on the educational background and interests of all the world leaders.
Oh, yeah.
He came up with one who had a background in environmental science. So I think it was one out of 192 at that stage. This was either the president or the prime minister of the Maldives, who famously held a cabinet meeting underwater.
That's right.
To highlight the dangers of rising sea levels. Well, he was replaced, I think, by a military leader in a coup some years later. So if there's no national or indeed international political will to grasp these problems, those attitudes are reflected in our media. What we are sort of force-fed, we hear and listen to every day.
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously right, but it's chicken and egg again, isn't it? It's because the democratic dimension of this conversation is in many ways the same as the media dimension, as you're recognising. But it's popularity rules. You know, if you could win more votes by shouting from the rooftops about this, or by having your cabinet meetings underwater. Admittedly, a military coup is a slightly exceptional circumstance in the context of democracy. But if it worked, it would happen more. So the fact that the people aren't buying into it is only partly due to the fact that the leaders aren't leading properly, because they would lead properly on this issue if the people were buying into it. It's a proper chicken and egg scenario.
Well, it is, and a lot of it, of course, goes back to timescales of where people gain their information from.
Yeah, but why would I find it, if I was built slightly differently, I'd find it really, really easy this week to make, not you probably, but a lot of people who listen to this radio station, I can make you very cross about a largely mythical portion of society who are registered disabled and not working. You know, if I was a Tory minister called Laura Trott, I could describe their duty to go to work, and it would speak not perhaps to a huge proportion of the population, but enough to be democratically significant. And yet when I'm talking about an actual existential threat to you and your children, I can't connect the dots. I can't make it land. No one can.
Now we're back to the populist rump of approximately 20% of the population.
Maybe we are, but no, we're not. So I can't touch them. I can't touch them. But the 40, the 50, the 60% of the population who know but don't care enough.
They're split in too many political directions.
Yeah, possibly that's it.
The concentration is on the 20% who, in essence, become the 25% of people who actually are bothered to vote in an election, and that maintains the status quo. We are a centre-left society by a ratio of about 3 to 1, but because that three quarters is split between multiple parties, and because of our first past the post system, those people will never have a true voice.
And partly, again, because they don't think, even if they had a true voice, even if they exercised it, they don't think they would be heard correctly until they are heard. And of course, the more noise they make, the more likely they become to be heard. I can't overplay the chicken and egg principle at this point, I don't think. There's so much going on there that fits under that categorisation. Clive, thank you. Rachel's in Bedford. Rachel, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning. I wish you hadn't put me on after Clive, because I'm going to sound so basic.
Right, do you know what? Do you know what I'm going to do now? Did you listen? I'm going to tell you off. Did you listen to the phone-in that we had about a month ago about women who say sorry?
Oh, I hate that. No, I do. I
you just did it.
Up on that. Did I say sorry?
Well, you essentially said, I wish I wasn't coming on after Clive. No, you didn't actually say sorry, but you kind of apologised. Didn't you?
And I think I'm complaining rather than apologising.
No men ever do that. No man would come on and say, I'm not going to be as good as the caller before. No man would ever do that.
Yeah, but even if Clive was a woman, I'd say that. I think I'm sitting here, I'm painting, and you just got me thinking, because
sorry,
you do care, but it bothers you that you don't care.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean? So I'm the same. It bothers me that I don't care enough. I don't care enough. And you got me thinking about this, and I think part of it is I can't project myself into my children's future and imagine this turmoil, this awful world that's been caused by. I find that difficult, so I can't connect there. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
But I do wonder if I don't feel impacted by it yet. So I don't see terrible weather, apart from maybe last year when it was 40 degrees. If you'd have asked me last year when I was on the sofa in a wet sheet trying to cool down, if I cared,
you might have been more
change,
receptive.
I probably would have cared. Exactly, I'd have cared.
And then the next day it rains.
Yeah, exactly. And then we forget, and I'm not the only person, but I need feedback. I need to know that any effort I am putting in is making a difference. So I got rid of my car. I've got us all bikes. My sister-in-law helped with that. But I don't know. I mean, does just recycling make a difference? I don't know that what I'm doing is actually making a difference. I don't think it's in our faces enough. Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean.
But do you think if people could join the dots and make that connection, do you think, like, the Hughes of the world, do you think we'd behave differently? Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, but it's all out there. It's just you're choosing whether or not. I'd love to do an experiment, like a Channel 4 television programme where we take over the media and we use the language, the rhetoric, the style, the tone that they use for demonising refugees to demonise the climate crisis. It just would be really interesting. Give it 6 months. What would happen? We get to the Daily Mail front pages. Instead of having 13 front pages about Keir Starmer's curry, you have 13 front pages about heat waves in Rio de Janeiro or melting glaciers or species coming extinct.
But do you think we then become desensitised to it as well?
We never get desensitised to bile about refugees, do they?
That's true. But it's all like the language, like you open.
It would be really interesting.
And
you could knit the two together, Rachel, because an awful lot of the people who are trying to make their way across continents in pursuit of a better existence are fleeing the consequences, in some cases, of climate change. And that's going to be the defining issue of future generations. That is going to be the big engine of migration moving forward. People moving from parts of the world that are unbearable to parts of the world that are bearable. And Northern Europeans live in a part of the world that is bearable. So, that again should be something that we're looking at. When those two collide, the population gets caught between the sort of Scylla and Charybdis of climate change migration and demonisation of migration, things could get really, really ugly. Unless we're ready for it. It's 11 o'clock.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 11 is the time. I wonder whether it's significant that we're moving on. We didn't necessarily need to. There were calls. It wasn't groaning, was it, the switchboard? It was at first. It usually is by about sort of 20 past 10 in the morning, and indeed 20 past 11. But there are some topics I find so engaging and so interesting that I will sometimes stay with them for 2 hours, even 3 hours. And yet we are moving on. A very reflective programme today. I can't think why. Absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I had quite a late night last night as part of the Global's Make Some Noise event, which is one of the proudest nights of the year, actually, for people who work for Global Radio. An incredible event, and no doubt I'll be sharing news of how much money we managed to raise shortly. But we move on, and we move into an area that, again, I guess, gets filed under a particularly personal interest, but it is national news today, so it's not the case that I'm indulging very esoteric interests. Single-sex schools. Single-sex schools. I wonder what the proportion of the population is that attended one. I wonder how many people attended one throughout, from sort of 3 to 18. I did, but rather oddly, the first single-sex school I attended was a girls' school. It was a convent school that allowed sort of 2 or 3 boys into each year. It was me and Peter Tappero and Simon Atkinson were in kindergarten together, and by the time we reached the age of 6, you had to leave. But because I'd love to claim that I was, what's the word for not a prodigy, what's the word for a kid who's quite advanced, ahead of their age? I'd love to claim that that's what it was, but it wasn't. It's just Mum couldn't wait to get me out of the house. So I started school a bit earlier than other people, and that meant that by the time I was coming to the end of kindergarten, I wasn't old enough to move on to the next school. So I think I am the only boy in history to go into Junior 1 at the Holy Trinity Convent. What was the Holy Trinity Convent? It's no longer a convent, it's now a school. But I think I was the only boy ever to go into Junior 1 at the Holy Trinity Convent in Kidderminster. Sister Mary Francis was in charge. And it was only because of my age, because I'd started school early and they wouldn't let me go to my next school until I was 7, which was in January. So I did 1 term in Junior 1 at an all-girls school. So I've only ever been educated in single-sex environments, even though I wasn't the sex that was the singular sex that the first school I attended catered for or accommodated. Quite a lot to talk about here. Girls' schools will mix with boys' schools more in academic settings in an effort to tackle misogyny and sexual harassment. So for whose benefit is this? It's incredible, really. The Girls' Schools Association have an annual conference in Cirencester, and Finola Kennedy, who's the head of Wimbledon High, a private girls' school in London, said that pupils were experiencing more and more misogyny, thanks to people like that Andrew Tate character, who's a very good example of what I was talking about at 10 o'clock. If you are desperate for clicks, if you care more about attention than you do about integrity or principles or people, then you'll have him on your show as a sort of 21st century equivalent of a bearded lady or some sort of freak show, you know, whatever it may be, and you know, be damned the damage that it does to young men and, of course, by association, young women. So this particular school has launched a charter with a boys' school in Wimbledon, just up the road, after pupils posted anonymously about their experiences of sexual harassment and abuse. So it's boys' schools that are becoming hotbeds of misogynistic views, both globally and in schools. You've got men who believe that women belong in the home, that they shouldn't be driving, that they are a man's property. This Tate character talks about choking women and trashing their belongings. Crikey, it's a therapist's dream, really. Goodness knows what went on in his childhood that turned him into someone who hates women and seeks dominion over them. But it is something that I think would take even more of a hold in an all-boys school than it would in a mixed school. I've thought this for some time, and I wonder whether I'm a bit older. I've become a bit more cynical. You know, I always think that mixing and integration are the best weapons against bigotry. So how can you sustain your hatred for people with brown skin if you're playing in the same football team? Or if you're mates? How can you sustain your misogyny if there are girls in your class? And I went to an all-boys school from the age of 7 to the age of 18. And I think things were a heck of a lot better than they are now. I think that we were encouraged not to be misogynistic, not to be bigoted, not to be almost... Maybe there was a little bit of paternalism, a little bit of... a little bit of, you know, when chivalry and sexism collide, you think you're being chivalrous, but you're doing things you'd never do to a man. So even holding a door open, I don't want to have a conversation about this. I'm just sort of highlighting how confusing it can be. So I'm not going to ask you a complicated question. I'm just going to ask you whether or not single-sex schools are bad for you. 0345 6060 973. I think a lot about the path not taken. We talk about it quite a lot, don't we? It's counterfactual. What would your life be like if ... So as an adopted person, I'm very conscious of the life not lived, the person I would have been if I hadn't been adopted by the parents I was adopted by, or if I hadn't been adopted at all. It's easier, I think, for adopted. Stuart Lee and I talked about this at an event we did together last couple of weeks ago, and I noticed Stuart is trending today. Whenever Stuart is trending on Twitter, it's usually because somebody somewhere on social media has asked, who's the best comedian you've ever seen live? And Stuart just starts trending because he is the best comedian most of us have ever seen live. I love that. I think I haven't checked. I hope it's not a less felicitous reason for trending, but generally speaking, it just means that somebody somewhere has posed a question on Twitter. Who's your favourite comedian? Who's the best comedian? Who's the comedian that you'd pay to see? And so many people just type Stuart Lee that he ends up trending on social media. And yet when you talk to him, he doesn't think he's well known. When he was on Full Disclosure, he was talking about getting into taxis, and the taxi driver always asking him what he does, and he tells him, he goes, "Would I have heard of you?" He's this fascinating combination of brilliance and modesty. Like, seriously, one of the most talented people you could ever hope to meet, let alone see live. Just a genius, and yet possessed of this curious modesty. I just mention that in passing because he is also adopted. So the idea of the life not lived is something that we have in common. But what if I'd not gone to an all-boys school? How different would I be? How different would you be, particularly as a woman, if you had gone to a mixed school? And how can we ever know? I guess you might do the sixth form. You might change in the sixth form one way or the other. You might go from a mixed school to a single-sex school, or you might go from a single-sex school to a mixed school. I think my 20s would have been a lot easier. I think that but again, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's like this at a mixed school as well. Is that you see every woman in sexual terms or not, and if you don't see them in sexual terms, then you're not really interested when you're young. That's what it was like coming from an all-boys school, a very repressed and religious all-boys school. As you suffer, because it was a Catholic school as well, you suffer from that syndrome where there's something wrong with the girls who have sex, and yet you're fetishizing the girls who don't. That just weird behaviour. But I don't know how much of that is Catholicism and how much of that is a single-sex school. Does it do us damage? And how would we know? Can you put your hand on your heart and tell me that going to a single-sex school did you damage? How do you know it did? 0345 6060973. And I want to do two topics here, if I can, and they're quite different, similar, linked, but different. How do you deal with misogyny in your own son? I really want you to talk to me about this. So there's a broad question here about single-sex schools. I've got a feeling that they're good for girls and bad for boys. If I had to put together a thesis, that would be it. And actually, so far, it is women getting in touch with me. 0345 6060973. But this notion of... I hesitate to give him any more oxygen, to give him any more coverage, but there are some very influential people on the internet whose misogynistic views are spreading. Teachers will tell you, teachers of young boys will tell you that this Tate character is a serious problem. Seems to have gone off the boil a little bit, perhaps in recent months, but I don't know. Maybe we've just stopped talking about it. So how do you do it? How do you do it? If it's your son? Mums or dads? I genuinely mean that. I don't have a preference at all on that. But mums or dads, if your boy starts presenting you with evidence of fairly genuine misogyny, women are belongings, women should be disciplined, women shouldn't drive, women belong in the home. Yeah, the Republicans in America have tried to dress it up as a positive. They call it the trad wife scenario, and it's, alpha males will look after their women and all of that. I mean, it's absolute baloney. It's all about robbing women of autonomy. But if it's your own son, how does it feel? Not just how do you deal with it, but how much of it is your fault? So two questions. One about single-sex schools and whether or not they do as I fear, some fairly deep damage, especially boys. 0345 6060973. But the second question, because this conversation about single-sex schools is inspired by misogyny, it is girls' schools insisting or seeking to mix more with boys' schools in the hope of diluting the misogyny that's taking hold in boys' schools. So there's more evidence of the damage it can do. Much more likely to be misogynistic if you're at a single-sex boys' school, I think. But what happens if your boy brings it home? How do you deal with it? How shocked are you? How did you find out that your boy was nursing, your son was nursing some pretty grim opinions that had festered without your knowledge? Time is 11:16. 0345 6060973 is the number you need.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
19 minutes after 11. So the big question, the broader question about single-sex schools, and then the more specific question about misogyny in your home, when your son describes or behaves in a way that makes your blood run cold. I can't believe my boy believes this stuff. What happened? How do you deal with it? Nicola is in Great Missenden. Nicola, what would you like to say?
Hi, I was just going to say about the point about girls' schools, because I went to one in Buckinghamshire, and then when I went off to university, I was really, really shocked once I was in mixed groups about how the men talked over us and shouted over us. And I'd grown up with sort of turn-taking conversations, and so I don't think it really prepared me very well. It might have been better to grow up in that mixed environment where I might have got a bit more sort of toughness or been aware that was going to be the case. because I just spent the first year, I think, completely shocked.
I'm very conscious of not interrupting you or talking over you now, Nick, which is probably a first for me. But I think I'm an equal opportunities talker over her. I don't think I'm worse with women than I am with men, or vice versa. But one argument would be that single-sex schools, growing up in the absence of boys, actually create more independence of spirit, more intellectual independence.
Yeah. Well, I do think that's the counter-argument, because in some ways we were protected from all of that, and we didn't get any idea that there wasn't anything that we couldn't do that was just for the boys or stuff like that. But on the other hand, it wasn't really a sort of being prepared for the reality of it all. And yes. I don't know if that's harmful or not. I can't really decide.
Well, were you... I'm thinking of the class element here as much as the single-sex element. Were you knocking about with boys who had largely been at single-sex schools themselves?
Yes.
Yes,
mainly.
Get me,
I was doing law and
so public school boys.
Public school boys. A lot of shouty public school boys.
God save us from shouty public school boys, Nicola. God save us all.
Yes.
I just wonder whether if you'd been hanging out with boys who were used to having women around, you'd have had a very different experience.
Yeah, that could have been the case.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So I don't know why I knew that when you said that. I knew that you were talking about people like the ones I went to school with.
Yeah, some of them are in cabinet now.
We'll leave it there, shall we?
Yeah.
God save us. And there it is. And that so it's done them harm, although they won't realise it because they think it's given them the sort of skills that propel them into the cabinet. But the emotional illiteracy, the mild misogyny, the talking over women, it gets rewarded in our society. Our social structures reward that in men, but women, what are they taught? They're taught to take a back seat or to take second place. That absolutely fascinating. Andrew's in Birmingham. Andrew, what would you like to say?
Hello, hi, James. I went originally to a boys' school, and as the school went into secondary, when I was about 14, they introduced girls.
Gosh.
So I had been to a single-sex school at a very interesting time in my life. They brought another sex into the equation.
So you can make a comparison. It's quite an interesting point as well, like smack in the middle or just on the end of puberty.
Yes, indeed. I think the thing that really helped us was we had a very enlightened headmaster who absolutely did not tolerate any misogyny. However, when you're 14, you're roaring with hormones. You introduce this exotic species, given the fact that I hadn't really, socialised with girls until
I think unless you lived that, it's almost impossible to communicate it. This conversation must be so weird to the massive majority of people listening who've been in mixed classrooms since the age of 5, and throughout their school days. It is by far the common normal experience. And the idea of not having any members of the opposite sex in your environment, in your world, for all of your formative years is just bizarre.
It is bizarre in many ways. But having said that, my daughters went to a single-sex school, and I think it works better for girls than it does for boys. I think that maybe something in our makeup, I have no idea. But and maybe education, it could be environment, but boys on their own are not a good thing. When they mix with girls, they're better. But I think girls seem to do better on their own. They don't need boys.
No, except that, as Nicola reminded us, that then when they do move into an environment where boys are, if you like, in the box seat, overbearing and talking over, then it can push women into the background. And I don't think it's a coincidence that she mentioned some of the people she ended up at university with are now in the cabinet. That kind of dampening down of empathy or more feminine traits that we think of is something that is inculcated in all boys' public schools, almost as a way of life. 24 after 11. In fact, the phone lines are quite busy, but you might be able to squeeze in to tell me how weird this conversation is to you. So Nicola and Andrew and me all experienced single-sex schools, but that's going to put us in a relatively tiny minority. What are you hearing if you didn't go to one? How mad does this conversation sound? How can you even begin to grasp the difference in your life it would make if you had never shared a classroom with a member of the opposite sex? It must be huge, right? It must be so formative. And yet, as with everything else that's environmental, if it's what you know, it's all you know. Seb's in Haringey. Seb, what would you like to say?
Oh, yeah. I think following on a bit from what Nicola was saying, I was in a boys' grammar school that had a mixed sixth form. The girls that I'm still in contact with, and for context, we're all 28 years now, 28 years old now. The girls that I'm still good friends with are still dealing with the sort of harrowing experience they had when they moved into sixth form, talking about, I was saying to your producer that we had a thing called Beef Mondays.
Right.
Beef in the sense of you'd have between people argument, that sense. But when you came into the sixth form common room on a Monday, if you're a girl who'd had any sort of contact or relations with anyone, any man over the weekend, your whole week would be dominated by heckling and jokes and jibes.
Shaming behaviour, trying to shame women.
Shaming behaviour. Yeah, exactly. So
that's in a co-educational environment.
Co-education in the sixth form, yeah.
Yeah. So girls only came in for the sixth form at your school?
Yeah, that's right.
So that might be the worst of all worlds, actually, because you'd think of it as being an enlightening experience, but boys have got their attitudes that have been formed and honed in a single-sex environment, and then women arrive, girls arrive, and they don't change their attitudes at all. They just inflict what was previously something Nigel Farage would describe as locker room talk. They just involve the women in it, even as it objectifies and shames the women involved.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I think unless they're joining from year 7, then, like you say, those sort of attitudes have been moulded by the time they've reached sexual maturity or immaturity.
And you're only 20, so you're 28. See, this is one of the areas where I think that things have got worse since I was young, although it would be hard to prove that, but maybe we just talk about it more. Maybe, Nicola's generation kind of just dealt with it and filed it away, whereas it's a plus in a way. In an ideal world, they wouldn't be enduring it, but that they talk about it, that women talk about it now and know that it's not right, even if they didn't fully appreciate that at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And I just know from the experience of, and admittedly a small sample size, but the 3 girls that I know that went to that school are still dealing with the...
Well, you would be. I mean, crikey, with the shame stays with you. People, shame is one of the great engines of human behaviour, one of the great unrecognised engines of human behaviour. You don't realise how much of your behaviour is driven by childhood shame. And shame is trauma, It's tiny little things like, just I don't know, wetting yourself in kindergarten. People are still dealing with that. So to be shamed publicly like that and to have to laugh it off or pretend that you were comfortable with it. That's one of the great questions, actually, Seb. Thank you for leading us to that, is why do men in these environments, why do teenagers, sixth formers, why do men have all the power? Even in a co-educational environment. It's almost always boys and men who have the power, which is weird. It must be social conditioning because it's not innate. Susan's in Croydon. Susan, what would you like to say?
Well, I've had a different experience. I feel like I've had the best of both worlds. I mean, my mum yanked my brother out of, this is in Canada, so, the government public school system was doing experimental stuff in the 60s where you just studied what you wanted to do, and she said, this is ridiculous. So she put my brother into a private school. Then when I was born, she decided that she was going to start with me she wasn't even going to go to the government school. She was going to put me directly into a private school. Now, I saw my brother, who was 10 years older, doing lots of work, and I just thought private schools for idiots because it was too much work. So I deliberately failed the entrance exam so that I didn't go. And then they used reverse psychology on me, saying that I wasn't smart enough to get in. So when I was age 12, I took the entrance exam and I got in. And what I noticed was the girls that had been at that school from the first grade, I found them very meek. I used to describe them to my mom as if you took like toast and you dumped it in warm milk. That's kind of how I call them as milk toasty girls, because they just didn't have assertiveness. They didn't have, they were just very bland.
Yeah, okay.
So I actually thought that the first 6 years that I spent in a co-ed school really gave me some sort of some good skills, because I was grappling with the boys, I was doing things. And then when I went into what I call the really serious years, where you're really studying because you want to go to university, etc., because I was in a single-sex school, I was able to sort of focus on my education and developing the skills that I needed for university. Yeah. And then I didn't have to worry about, I don't want to look too smart because then the boys might not like me, which is what you hear happening, at co-ed schools. So even though my mom and I had to agree to disagree, I think actually what I did age 6 was the best thing I ever did for myself.
But you see, it removes the air of exoticism as well, doesn't it? It makes it normal. So you reach your formative years without any sense of the other sex, the opposite sex, being a different species. You're perfectly comfortable and used to it, but equally, you're not going to be distracted or defined.
And you can hold your own in it as well.
Exactly that. But you don't have to.
Before society has gotten to old girls and boys, and then, you're much more confident. That's what I saw. All the girls that came in that had gone to a co-ed school before seemed much more assertive, much more with it than the ones that had been there from grade 1 to 6.
Well, it's horses for courses, isn't it? Because, I think that some of the women that come out of single-sex schools, without necessarily having gone to a mixed school earlier, can be the ones that do have the most independent minds, the ones that sort of haven't fallen into that trap of thinking that men have the power or that men deserve to be in the driving seat, even subconsciously. But it is, every experience is going to be different. It's about the tides of society, isn't it? It's 11:31. I haven't had a call yet from a mum or a dad who has experienced misogyny from their own son and been really shocked by it. I would very much like to know what that's like. Angela concurs that it is worse now. Boys and young men of my generation, she says, I'm about the same age as you, James, did not, for the most part, behave like many of my daughter's generation do now. I think something has got worse in that area. It'd be interesting to pin down precisely why. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:35 is the time. Not tempted. At the moment, we are intending to confine coverage of the COVID inquiry to the news headlines. You'll find out what Chris Whitty has been saying. Later in the day, you may have a more detailed catch-up, but we'll have a proper roundup, I think, on tomorrow's programme as well. Jonathan Van Tam, due to give evidence a little later. Chris Whitty giving more evidence today, 36 after 11. I haven't quite pinned down the way to make that a conversation between us. Touched upon it yesterday, not very happily, actually. I think I was quite clumsy in my setup of the subject yesterday, questioning whether or not we're overreacting to the apparent callousness of the language that was deployed. But what we are discussing, what we are contemplating is grim evidence of some cultural failings in Downing Street that are close to psychopathic, and yet the right way of having a conversation about it hasn't properly occurred to me yet. So feel free to help me out. 11:36 is the time. The conversation about single-sex schools. You're right. Whoever's accusing me of generalising, we are generalising. Of course we are, but generalising through individual experiences. So. It makes for illuminating conversation, and it is important as well, not least because of what Nicola touched upon accidentally at the end of her contribution, when she pointed out that some of the single-sex educated boys that she went to school with run the country now. And you can't help thinking that perhaps if they had been introduced to a slightly more representative experience of the population at an earlier age, they wouldn't be quite as, what's the word you want, blinkered, cosseted, unempathetic, backwards, emotionally illiterate. All of those things possibly are consequences of attending a school like mine. It is 11:37 and Donna is in Hausa in Norway. Donna, what would you like to say?
Hi, I'm a little bit nervous because I've never actually discussed this in a public forum before.
Okay.
So I have a boy and a girl. They're both in their late 20s now.
Right.
My son, unfortunately, hasn't spoken to me for the last 9 years.
Oh.
So I'm talking about the misogynistic...
Oh, I'm sorry. Gosh.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's just incredibly shocking to me. It started when he was about 14, 15. He went to private school.
Right.
Same school as my daughter, so mixed sexes, so that was fine. He first started showing visible signs of this. He was about 14 and he verbally assaulted a female teacher in a sexual manner, which obviously I won't repeat what he said.
No.
So actually the school were very good, but I felt that they didn't deal with it severely enough. So I have contacts in the police force. I took him to the police station just to have a nice general little chat to say, the progression of this,
yes,
it carries on.
It's not going to end well.
Exactly. So anyway, me and his father ended up getting divorced.
Right.
It was a terrible 2-3 years. We lived in the same house.
Oh.
My son verbally assaulted me on a daily basis, saying, you shouldn't be here. Daddy's paid for this. Daddy's paid for that.
Wow.
Verbally assaulted my daughter on a daily basis. Daddy paid for your education. You have to do this. You have to do that. Mommy has to, be chained to the kitchen sink, make the beds, clean the house. As a woman and a mum, for me, I'm quite strong-headed.
Sure.
I'm a mountaineer. I've gone all over the world, climbing mountains, run ultramarathons.
Right.
And to be brought to my knees mentally because of this continuous abuse was horrendous.
I can only imagine, Donna. Where was it coming from?
Oh, his father's side. Don't get me wrong, obviously when you divorce, there's 50-50 to blame. But on his side, his father was exactly the same, and he channeled his anger through to my son. So my son just soaked it up like a wet sponge.
Oh.
My husband's father, exactly the same pattern. Treated his wife horrendously. My ex-husband treated me horrendously, but he knew that he couldn't channel that anger and frustration at me through a divorce. So he used it on my son. And it's continued to this day. My daughter and my son don't even talk anymore, as I don't. And it's not because I chose to do that, it's because he's chosen to do that.
Do you think he hates all women?
No, I mean, he's a good-looking boy and he's actually got the most beautiful heart. But his outlook on women is so disjointed. And I do blame the internet a lot for that. I mean, he's in his late 20s now, so this Tate character wasn't around, I don't think, then.
No, I don't
But
think so.
when I look back and reflect, you could actually see the build-up of what was coming through the internet, all the porn and all this just,
It's subjugation.
Women.
It's a subjugation of women and a fantasy that women welcome it or invite it, which is presented in pornography all the time.
Absolutely.
So just one thing that confuses me, and I'm being curious, so forgive me if I'm being prurient.
My heart rate's going down now, so I'm okay.
There we go. Fantastic. I love the idea of you climbing mountains without getting remotely flustered at all and then getting nervous when you ring into the show. It's a bit mad.
This is my Everest.
More of a Snowdon, I think. When you look back, I mean, I'm just intrigued by what your husband was like towards you, given that you clearly were very strong-willed and independent at the same time. How did that happen? I
was, to be honest, James, when we married, I think I was a little bit blindsided. And again, I'm not blaming him entirely.
Sure.
I had my blame for, he's, again, a good heart.
Yes.
But the dripping, my parents, when my mother was alive, she said the dripping of your soul was just coming out.
Gosh.
And literally, like my father would tell you now, I'd become almost like a zombie. I just lost myself. And I think my son just saw that.
Got it.
And I think it's learnt behaviour, absolute classic learnt behaviour.
And exacerbated by social conditions, exacerbated by some of the direction that society has taken. It's remarkable. No one is disputing the idea, and your lad would be at the upper end of the age range generationally, that it is worse now than it was when we were young.
I'm sure now, I mean, hypothetically, I'm sure that he knows of this Tate character, and I'm sure he probably is a cheerleader for that behaviour, unless he's changed dramatically. But I'm sure that I've always left my door open, obviously, for him.
It's a long
but
time,
I'm sure
isn't it?
It is. It's a lot of Christmases and a lot of birthdays.
For both of you as well, I wonder.
Yeah.
Well, it's good that the door's open. And does your daughter, your daughter has no contact with him either.
No. But
so you don't know. You'd know if he had a child or something like that. You'd know if you became a grandma, would you? Or
no.
Oh, crikey.
No, not at all, because I feel that it's wrong to put pressure on my daughter if she does know, because she still lives with her father, because she can't buy a house. The political side of that.
Covering a lot of topics today, Donna. I like it. No, so you don't want her to become a pawn in your dealings with her dad. It's crikey. I'm sorry for that, and obviously it's better for you not to have that toxicity in your life. But I hope he comes round, and it's a powerful reminder that the people that we're talking about deserve sympathy as well, because that's an internalization of misogyny or hatred or bitterness and bile, and it must be doing untold damage to him, as you say, to his good heart, his otherwise good heart. But these are influences, whether you're taking them from home in the case of a father, or whether you're taking them from outside in the case of so-called influencers on the internet. And also some of them, of course, write books as well. And it seems fairly clear that everybody qualified to comment thinks things are worse now than they were 20 or 30 years ago, which is really grim, actually. The more you think about it, the grimmer it becomes. Donna, take care. Happy climbing. It's 11:45.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:48. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are poised for PMQs, which will be swiftly followed by Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement, all of which we will take live on LBC. So Natasha will join me shortly for a little aperitif, a quick talk on what we expect to come up at PMQs, and possibly even a little bit of a pre-game warm-up on the autumn statement as well. All I can tell you for certain about the autumn statement is that the Metropolitan elite will come out of it better off than they went in. And I genuinely, I know I'm labouring this point, but I really think you should bear that in mind next time the same politicians are trying to tell you that their sworn enemies are the Metropolitan elite. If you hate us so much, why do you keep giving us money in your budgets? There's something not quite right about that, something a little bit rum. But 110, did I hear in the news bulletin, things that Jeremy Hunt is going to refer to? Oh, let joy be unconfined. I know I probably will clock off early, actually. I don't know if I should tell you this, but when he starts talking, if we expect him to be talking for more than half an hour, I'll just go, and Sheila Fogarty can start early and listen to it and then pick up when he finishes. Should I have cleared that with management first, do you think? Is that... Well, don't look at me like that. I've said it on the radio now. I could get into all sorts of... Well, that's the plan at the moment. Obviously, if the door is shut, I won't be able to get out. They might lock me in. So I have to listen to Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement. 10 to 12 is the time. Misogyny and single-sex education. We'll do it another day, the question of why has it got worse. But it is bizarre, isn't it? Fiona's in Kingston. Fiona, what would you like to say?
Hi there.
Hello.
I went to a mixed-sex school. Right. It was a long time ago, but it was just a normal state school.
Yes.
And but I now live in an area where they're mostly single-sex schools. There is one mix, but they're mostly single-sex. It's quite normal to go to them, not private schools.
Yes, okay.
So my son goes to a single-sex school, and I kind of wanted to say two things. I experienced a lot of sexism and misogyny, and when I was at school a long time ago, It was just normal. We didn't complain about it. We accepted it.
Right.
So the difference for me is that it was just normal life. You would just, accept being grabbed or spoken to in a certain way.
Incredible,
and
really.
What happened.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's more, people are called out for it more. So whether it's worse, I don't know the answer, but I think there's that part to it as well.
Has your son got healthy attitudes?
I think I say yes.
Yeah.
I think so, and I hope so. But I think that a lot of that comes from the school they're at. The
yes,
head
of course.
at their school
Makes a huge difference, doesn't it? Actually, we probably overlooked that. It's good of you to remind us that the ethos of the school is going to be critical to everything that we've talked about.
Absolutely, the ethos, and they have different charity groups come in talking about men and women and sexism, misogyny, that kind of thing. So it's part of what they do and part of what they talk about in their school.
Is there a downside to him not having girls in his life, in his scholastic life?
I'd say yes. I think socially there is. Again, there's because there's a girls' school and a boys' school close to each other, so
right.
There are some social things that happen, or people have a brother or sister, and there's socially there is mixing between the boys and the girls,
right.
which is good for them. But yes, I agree that is limiting. But also, I think that definitely at primary school, my experience is that the boys were naughty. Like, it was the naughty boys.
Yeah.
All the girls are good and the boys are naughty. And I I have a daughter as well, and I consider myself to be a feminist. But
sure.
It's interesting to be the mum of a boy.
Yes, I can imagine.
And so I think that at a single-sex boys' school, you're not all just naughty boys. You're just a boy who likes this or a boy who likes that, or, you're more individual rather than have this label. So there's a benefit as well as a cost.
Yeah, always.
So,
And as you point out, the influences coming from school and from home can be safeguards against a lot of the bad stuff that might otherwise happen.
Absolutely, because I think the head definitely, calls things out or addresses things as they come up. As they,
yes, and some of that will be reactive, and that the whole of that scandal, I forget what the hashtag was, but the whole of I shouldn't forget. I should make sure that I flipping well remember. But the anonymous online postings that occurred on the Everyone's Invited website were staggering, even for teachers that I know who had no idea of what was commonplace, and you'd think that they would know, which is why none of us, Fiona included, can say with absolute certainty that our children's attitudes are healthy. Donna touched a lot of us, judging by the inbox. My dad did exactly the same, writes Rob, who's in Norwich, as the lady who hasn't had contact with her son for years. From the age of 14, when my parents split up, he constantly used abusive language towards my mother in my presence. He would call her a prostitute, a slut, a whore, and insinuate that she had no morals and was sleeping around. All this was because I now realise he was using me to vent his anger when he didn't have contact with my mum. He'd do it. He couldn't do it directly, so he did it at me. Ironically, his first marriage had ended due to him cheating, although he never admitted this, and I found out from my half-brother years later. It had a massive impact on me, James, and my trust in my mother was destroyed for years. Thankfully, we have a good relationship now, but I despise him for what he put me through and cut contact with him at the age of 20-odd. I've never forgiven him. He died 4 years ago without us ever talking again, and it's impacted my adult life that I never really had a proper relationship, as I'm terrified I will turn into the same bitter old man that he was. Rob, I think you'd be all right, mate. With that level of self-knowledge and understanding, I'm pretty sure you'd be all right, but, I'm just a gob on a stick on the radio. I can't walk a mile in your shoes. 11:55 is the time. I'm going to squeeze in one more call and then we'll go to Natasha to tee up PMQs. Millie's in Lincoln. Millie, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello.
So I'm on more of the younger side of this. So I'm in my second year of university.
Okay.
And I went to a girls' school from 7 to 11, and then it was joint with the boys' school for sixth form.
Right.
I thoroughly enjoyed my time whilst being in a girls' school. But in sixth form, it took a drastic change, to say the least.
Right.
In the very first politics lesson of the year, the teacher turned around and said, "So how do you guys feel now that you're with boys and boys with girls?" And one of the boys put their hands up and said, "I can't believe that I'm sat in an A-level politics class right now because women shouldn't even have the vote."
And is that evidence of systemic misogyny or just one prat in your politics class? Or both?
Well,
or both?
It sparked a bit of a debate. Because
what a wazzock, honestly.
Eventually, obviously, word got out of like at break times, people were talking about it, and there was this massive divide in the sixth form for quite a couple of weeks because it was this group of boys who had been in boys' education from 7 to 11 and who now were with girls who had these views of kind of like, well, why are women either in further education? Why are they doing their A-level?
Extraordinary, and you're 19.
Yes.
Absolutely extraordinary. Where do you? I know this. You won't be able to answer this comprehensively, but you can give us a nudge. What were they being influenced by? Because you don't arrive in a place like that by accident. I don't mean Lincoln. I mean the opinions that they held.
Yeah, I think it was because the boys' school was greatly favoured over the girls' school. The boys' school got all the big sports pitches, everything that went on. If they had somebody coming in to do like a talk or something, the boys' school would get it. The girls' school got none. Our girls' school was literally this tiny, tiny building, whereas the boys' school
they were just entitled.
Huge place.
They were just used to power, used to having everything their own way. It goes further than that. I went to a school like the one you described, but I didn't come out thinking women shouldn't have the vote when I was doing my politics A-level. So there must have been something else going on as well, almost as if they're performing for each other. Do you know what I mean? So like trying to be shocking and trying to be obnoxious. Well, you said at the outset you enjoyed it, so I'm glad that the polluting element of your politics class was not the dominant one. Millie, I did warn you that we'd have to be brief because PMQs is on the horizon. Natasha Clark joins us now. Go on then. What's going to come up this week?
Well, I wonder, James. I think it's going to be autumn statement related. Obviously, we're just waiting for that autumn statement today. 12:40, we're expecting Jeremy Hunt to pop up and to tell us all about why we're going to be better off, apparently. I think Rishi will probably talk about the taxes that he apparently is about to cut. He will probably talk about inflation falling. He'll try and convince us that even though it's gone down from around 6.7% to 4.6%, he's going to tell you that it means that you'll be better off. He's going to say he's going to get the economy growing, etc., etc.
Yes, there was a community note applied to one of his press releases yesterday when he wrote, everyone said we wouldn't get inflation down and we have. And it was corrected, even on the sewer that is Twitter these days. It was corrected by evidence that no one ever said that. Everybody said it's going to come down anyway, regardless of what the government does. So we're in quite a strange space politically when the governing party is putting proven untruths out and claiming successes where there is none in the public space. So I guess in that context, he might make all sorts of claims about inflation that don't stand up to scrutiny.
He's actually doubled down on that as well this morning. The Prime Minister's told Cabinet that it was no accident stability has been restored to the economy and inflation has halved. It was the result of actions taken by the government.
So
That's
when it was rocketing last year, that means logically that must have been the result of actions taken by the government as well.
It's a good conclusion to make, isn't it?
Yeah, and he wouldn't let Jim Pickard ask that question, I'm told, at a press conference earlier this week. He didn't allow the Financial Times to ask a question about finances.
Well, that is usually how the Number 10 works, is that they rotate the questions. So I'm going to defend them on that one. And as you know, LBC's reporter, Fraser Knight, got a question.
He did ask a very good question,
So I'm glad that we cleared that one up. But yes, I think this one, in terms of this claim that inflation falling is down to the government, is going to come back. I think Keir Starmer might mention that at Prime Minister's questions and tell us all that, despite inflation falling, food inflation still going up, energy prices still very high, and the government not expected to announce any more support for energy bills over the winter. And I imagine Keir Starmer is going to try this Prime Minister's questions to sow the seed in people's minds. Are you better off or worse off after 13 years of the Conservative government? And even though they are about to promise you all lots of tax sweeteners, can you keep that in your mind?
Well, let's find out. We'll come back to you after PMQ.
4 teenagers who died in a car accident in North Wales. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure we'll touch on it later, but let me just say we welcome the agreement reached overnight for a humanitarian pause in Gaza. This is something that we have consistently pushed for and is a crucial step towards ending the nightmare for families of those taken hostage in Hamas's terror attack and also addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Justin Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, his government will say that disabled people have a duty to work from home or lose their benefits, as if a suitable job of this kind is something that can be conjured up at will.
Bit of a premature crossing to the House of Commons there. My bad. I do apologise. We'll cross back as soon as Keir Starmer gets to his feet. Did I make it obvious enough that I wasn't really speaking to you then, but to my esteemed colleagues? When Keir Starmer gets to his feet, we'll cross back to the House of Commons. Thank you, lads. Any chance, Natasha, that Starmer will use issues other than the imminent autumn statement? I mean, they're in agreement on the foreign policy regarding the Middle East, so there's no room for manoeuvre there. I can't personally think of anywhere else he might go, but we've been wrong before.
We have, and I think there's a potential he could talk about the COVID inquiry, of course. Witty's revelations yesterday, locked down too late. But I think if I were him, I would try and focus on the economy. And yesterday, I think the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey gave him a reason to to talk about inflation staying high for a long time to come. I think if I were him, that would be one of the things that I would mention. And just generally, I think we can expect him to attack these tax cuts as a bit of a bribe to the electorate. That essentially we're going into an election, and aren't the Conservative Party just trying to win you over with a quick tax cut? Benefits crackdown is another potential option that I had for Keir Starmer to do. Will he come out and say this is going to be a very heartless policy from the Conservative government, trying to force more people who might not be able to work back into work? That's also another option he could have. But yes, I think if I were him, I'd be focusing on the economics. And we know the Labour Party want to focus on being the party of the economy in the run-up to the election. And that's a pretty big turnaround from the days of previous Labour governments, isn't it? When the Conservatives used to use it as such an attack line. And whether he'll be able to do that successfully or not, that's what Rishi Sunak's going to try and do today, and say, I'm going to be the guy that will cut your taxes. Labour will put them up. But yes, whether the electorate believe them or not, as we have the highest tax burden in modern times, is something to be seen.
Only time will tell. Big shift for you today. What's the timetable? PMQ's at 12, and then the autumn statement at 50:30?
It should be probably a little bit after, because we know they always drag on a little
and here
bit.
Is Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like the Prime Minister, I know the whole House will welcome the agreement reached overnight. We repeat our calls for Hamas to release all hostages immediately. This humanitarian pause must be used to get the hostages out safely, to tackle the urgent and unacceptable humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and to make progress to a full cessation of hostilities. Mr. Speaker, in recent years, the international community has treated the two-state solution as a slogan rather than a serious strategy, and that must now change. Like the Prime Minister, I'm sure I speak for everyone in the House in saying our hearts go out to the families and friends of the 4 young men from Shrewsbury who tragically lost their lives this week. It's a living nightmare for any parent, and I can hardly begin to imagine their loss. Mr. Speaker, this week the Prime Minister unveiled the latest version of his 5 pledges for the country. Let's hope he has more success with these than the last ones. Did he forget the NHS?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, not only when I became Prime Minister, just weeks after becoming Prime Minister, we injected record funding into the NHS and in social care. We also unveiled the first ever long-term workforce plan in the NHS's 75-year history. But I'm pleased he mentioned the 5 pledges because, as he knows, 3 of them are economic, and on a day which we will focus on the economy, I'm pleased to report that we have indeed halved inflation, no thanks to the party opposite. We have indeed grown the economy, and we have indeed reduced debt. That's a Conservative government delivering for this country.
Well, the reason he ignored the NHS, not only in his new pledges, but just now, is because 7.8 million people are currently on the waiting lists. That's 500,000 more than when he pledged to bring them down nearly a year ago. And the Prime Minister just claimed that this is all about economic growth. So let me ask him, if a labourer or a care worker is forced to wait a year for an operation, how are they meant to help grow the economy?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing an enormous amount to bring waiting lists down. Enormous amount. Expanding patient choice, rolling out new community diagnostic centres, new surgical hubs, as well as putting more doctors and nurses in our ward. But I guess the question, Mr. Speaker, is when he talks about targets and waiting lists, I really just hope that the Welsh Labour government aren't listening. Because after 25 years in power, they're missing every single one of his targets. Weren't they meant to be his blueprint?
Mr. Speaker, more than double the entire population of Wales are currently on a waiting list in England. He really needs to take some responsibility. And on his watch, 2.5 million people are too sick to work, with the majority also suffering from mental health issues. On top of his failures on waiting lists, can he tell us how many people are waiting for mental health treatment?
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, we've injected record sums to expand the number of mental health treatments in our country. But, Mr. Speaker, I talked about the practical things that we are doing with CDCs and surgical hubs. But he doesn't also seem to realise that the union action that he fails to condemn and that his members of parliament support from the picket lines have led to several 100,000 cancelled appointments, all making waiting lists worse. And he asked about Wales, but we can look at it. In Wales, over 70,000 people are waiting over 18 months for treatment, compared to in England, where thanks to our efforts, we have virtually eliminated 18 months wait. And that's the difference between us, Mr. Speaker. He wants to play politics, we get things done.
So raising the waiting list by 500,000 is getting things done. He's through the looking glass, this one. I asked the Prime Minister how many people are waiting for mental health treatment. He knows the answer, he just doesn't want to give it. 1.2 million. 200,000 are children, some waiting nearly 2 years to be seen. Would the Prime Minister accept those kind of delays if it were one of his family or friends?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the key things we are doing to bring down waiting lists is to expand the access of patient choice. It's a very straightforward idea to make sure that patients can choose where they get treated, and that way we will bring down waiting lists for mental health and other treatments far faster. Now, the Labour Party's policy on this is a total and utter mess. First, he promised, in his words, to ban NHS use of the independent sector. Then he said he wants more use of the independent sector. His shadow health secretary agreed with that, but then the deputy leader said that she would end it. As ever, you simply don't know what they stand for, and you can't trust a word they say.
As ever, no responsibility for the shocking state of the NHS. The truth is, the Prime Minister would not accept those waits for his family, and neither should anyone else. This morning, I spoke to an NHS nurse. For many months, Cam struggled to find time to see her 14-year-old son, Mikey, until he became seriously unwell. And now he hasn't been able to be in mainstream education for over a year. Mikey's mum is having to balance nursing with caring and being a parent. And this isn't a one-off. There are families up and down the country in exactly the same situation, working hard, trying to get through the cost of living crisis whilst desperately worried about relatives who can't get the treatment they need. How does he think they feel when they see the Prime Minister refusing to take responsibility and boasting that everything is fine?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing absolutely everything we can to put money into the NHS to bring down the waiting list, because I do want families up and down the country to have access to the healthcare that they need. He's absolutely right, they do deserve it. But then it is incredibly galling, Mr. Speaker, to hear this from someone who, when there are strikes happening in our hospitals and people are being denied access to emergency medical care, not only does he not have the strength to condemn it, he refuses to back legislation that would guarantee all the families that he talked about that access.
This is on his watch. It's his responsibility. 13 years in, and all he's got to offer is trying to blame the opposition for his failures. Over and over again. Mikey's mum. I'll tell you what Mikey's mum said to me this morning, shall I, if you're so interested to hear. She said, and I'm going to quote her, she said, whatever spin the government puts on it, you can't hide the reality for ordinary working people. That's her words. Worth reflecting on.
Yes.
Now, I'm glad that in recent years, real progress has been made in tackling the stigma surrounding mental health. But the fact remains that the suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds has doubled since 2010. And suicide is now the biggest killer of men under 45. And they're not just statistics. No. Every single one is a tragic loss to families and to friends. Politics has the ability to turn this around. It means tough choices. If we were to scrap tax loopholes, we could have thousands more staff, more support in our schools, more support in our communities. That would allow us to treat patients on time, getting them back to work, back to their families, and crucially, giving them their lives back. This is about mental health. That's Labour's plan. Will he back it?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was this government that for the first time in the NHS's history ensured that it had a long-term workforce plan, providing it with record funding so that we can eliminate long waits, but also ensuring that it has the money that it needs to train record numbers of doctors and nurses, whilst radically reforming how they work to improve productivity, because the only way we will get everyone the treatment that they need is to make sure that the NHS has a fantastic staff that it needs, and it's this government that has put that in place. And we can look, because he talks about records, Mr. Speaker, because this is something that no government has done in the past. It's something I'm proud we've done. Labour's record on this issue is clear. It was a disastrous failure of workforce planning. And those weren't my words, Mr. Speaker. Those was the verdict of the Labour-chaired Health Select Committee. It was Labour that did not train the consultants that we would need now, that take 13, 14, 15 or years to train. And it's this government that is for the first time making sure that every family will finally have the doctors and nurses that they need.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Access to housing that local people can afford is the biggest challenge we face in Cornwall. And whilst we need to build more houses, we need to ensure that they are available and affordable to local people and meet the needs of our rural and coastal communities. Now, local knowledge, particularly from elected representatives, is an important part in ensuring we achieve this. Yet the Leader of the Opposition has made clear that his intention is to ignore or override the views of local people in decisions on planning matters. Can the Prime Minister assure me and the people of Cornwall that under his government, the views of local communities will play a part in the planning process?
I thank my honourable friend for his excellent campaigning on behalf of his constituents, and I agree with him that housing must meet the needs of local communities, and our Affordable Homes programme is delivering hundreds of thousands of homes across the country. But crucially, on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we believe that local communities must be consulted. In contrast to Labour's plan, which is top-down housing targets, concreting over the Greenbelt and destroying our precious countryside.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think all of us in the Chamber are united in our relief at reports that hostages are due to be released by Hamas in Gaza. But we can't afford to lose sight of what comes at the other side of the temporary pause in hostilities that we are about to see. At the end of 4 days, do we simply see the return to the killing of children in Gaza every 10 minutes? Or do we choose in this House to instead back a permanent ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do welcome the agreement reached overnight. And as I said, this is something that we have consistently pushed for and is a crucial first step as we try and resolve this situation and indeed the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Of course, we want to see all hostages released as quickly as possible, including British nationals, and I would urge all parties involved to deliver the agreement in full. I would also like to put on record my thanks to Qatar for their important role, and we will continue to work with the United States and Israel to ensure the safe return of hostages and maximise the opportunity of this temporary pause to step up aid to suffering civilians in Gaza. It is something that we have pushed for, we've continued to do, and the UK is playing a leading role in delivering.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, ultimately it's not a pause in the killing of children that we need. It is an end to the killing of children that we need. And I can think of no better time than now for the Prime Minister to advocate for that permanent ceasefire. But given that he won't currently do that, will he instead lay the foundations for that two-state solution by finally recognising the state of Palestine?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually what the agreement that has been reached demonstrates that it wasn't right to have a unilateral ceasefire, and what was right was to do, as we have done, consistently push for a pause that would allow not just for aid to reach people in Gaza who desperately need it, but also for hostages to be released. That is what we have pushed for, and I'm glad that that is now being delivered versus a unilateral ceasefire, which would have emboldened and strengthened Hamas. And our position on the Middle East peace process more broadly is clear. We do support a negotiated settlement leading to a safe and secure Israel living alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. I've spoken to President Abbas and met with him to discuss this issue, and we are clear about strengthening the Palestinian Authority and reinvigorating efforts to find a two-state solution. And our long-standing position is that we would recognise the state of Palestine when it best serves the interests of peace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
17 minutes after 12, we will catch up with Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor, on what we just heard. I think it's fair to say that both of us got our predictions of what would come up in PMQs 100% categorically wrong. Long may it continue. You don't deserve this level of service.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
21 minutes after 12. About 10 minutes, we reckon, a little more perhaps, until Jeremy Hunt gets to his feet and delivers an autumn statement upon which quite a lot hangs in terms of credibility and governmental reputation. A slightly flabby PMQs, I felt, albeit that there were some moments of grave seriousness and potential shame. As Joe points out, nice to hear the number one killer of young men being ignored by the Prime Minister in favour of political jibes there. What a guy. I don't think you need me to point out that Joe is being deeply sarcastic there, as am I when I congratulate Natasha Clark on her superb predictions of what would come up in PMQs.
And to yours too, James.
Well, yeah, but it's just a sideline for me. It's a side hustle. It's your day job.
It is. I know. I should really resign, to be honest.
The NHS. I guess the NHS is always there, isn't it? It's a hardy perennial of topics that you reach for when nothing is more immediately obvious.
And it's a nice way, to be fair, to tie into the autumn statement, which we know that Jeremy Hunt is going to try and make it about mental health, about getting people back to work. And like I say, he touched on that very briefly in that. And then you've obviously got Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, trying to claim that all of his 5 promises, pledges that he made at the start of the year, trying to claim that 3 out of 5 of them have been met. Barely is my comment on that. And yesterday he obviously outlined another 5 more pledges.
How many
and he
is that?
did not mention the NHS.
10 pledges.
Well, actually,
are they pledges or promises?
I don't even know. Some of them have actually doubled up. Reducing debt appears in both of them. So,
so it's 9.
I don't know. Do we only back to 9?
Does he have to reduce debt twice now? Does he have to bring it down and then bring it down again?
Double it.
So have to halve inflation and then halve it again. Would that be a quarter? I'm not very good at that kind of maths.
Not great.
What's the credibility question like here, Natasha? I don't think that many members of the public are sitting there really believing much of what's coming out of the Prime Minister's mouth at the moment. Not just because of what we pointed out earlier about blatant untruths regarding everybody said we'd never bring inflation down, when in fact everybody said inflation was going to come down anyway. And 3 days after saying that the economy was growing, something that he's just doubled down on, it emerged that the economy was actually flatlining. And that's not an opinion, that's counting. So if there was any hope that Rishi Sunak would signal a return at least to reality being reflected by prime ministers after Boris Johnson, that hope is probably disappearing or has gone already.
Yeah, and this was the guy that said, I'm not going to tell, back in the Tory leadership campaign last year, is going to tell you what you need to hear rather than what I think you want to hear.
That's a great point.
And Rishi Sunak now is telling us that the economy is looking so much back on track, I think the Chancellor said earlier today, that we're now going to cut taxes. And I think he risks being incredibly disingenuous here, because that was exactly his selling point. He promised that he was going to tell us the truth about what was going on in the country and the economy. And I just don't think voters are going to buy the fact that the economy is growing, that debt is falling, when it literally is just a tiny 0.% percentage of growth, and the same with debt falling. It's just not going to wash, and we can see that in the opinion polls all the time, can't we? That voters just are not buying whatever the Conservative Party is throwing. And I think the question at the end of the day for voters and our callers will be, do you buy these tax cuts? Is this going to change your opinion of voting Conservative at the next election because they're going to throw a bit of money at you? Or are you going to look back at the last 13 years and go, am I really better off? And probably the answer is still no.
And Labour will keep hitting that sweet spot until the election. And of course, I guess the best way of illustrating your point about disingenuousness is to wonder whether the autumn statement that we're about to hear from Jeremy Hunt would bear any resemblance at all to an autumn statement that we might hear a year after a general election as opposed to a year before. This is part of an election campaign, effectively, and the desperate need to build some sort of platform on which to fight one.
It is, and that's always the way. Politicians always, just before a general election comes around, have an autumn statement and have a budget of sugar rush, tax cuts and sweetie promises for the voters that they want to stick in your mind when you're thinking about casting that at the ballot box. But is it going to wash when we've had such a difficult few years in terms of the public finances? And we know that voters always vote on the economic situation. And like we were saying earlier, it really does say a lot that Labour want to focus and want to fight this election on the issue of the economy. And, you've got Rachel Reeves, who will be standing up later to respond to Jeremy Hunt and respond to this budget, which perhaps is why Sir Keir Starmer decided to go on a slightly different tack in Prime Minister's questions just now, because obviously Rachel Reeves will have her answers to Jeremy Hunt later when she stands up and attacks this and goes, do you guys feel better off or not? Would it be better with the other guys? Well, you may as well give us a try, because these guys, look at what they've left you.
Back to the sweet spot. What do we know with a modicum of certainty that is going to be making tomorrow's headlines with regard to this statement?
Well, obviously, the main headline, the national insurance tax cut, has been floated around for ages. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see something else from the Chancellor, a white rabbit that has perhaps been a little bit more closely guarded. And
a pasty tax? We haven't had a pasty tax for a while.
We haven't had that for ages. Can't remember the last time we heard the word pasty tax.
So what would that look like? What would a rabbit look like? Don't say fluffy with big ears.
I don't know in terms of what it could look like. Maybe it's going to be just bigger than we expected. Maybe the headline of cutting national insurance will be bigger than was predicted. We don't know how much it's going to be cut by, so perhaps he cuts it big, and that's his rabbit. Obviously, we do know this benefits crackdown is coming. We do know that they will confirm that the benefits and pensions will go up in line with the higher rate of inflation, so that will be good news for people on benefits and pensioners as well. That's already been confirmed. Also, the news that if you agree to electricity pylon in your back garden, you'll be getting some extra energy bill help too. So there is quite a lot that the government have already trailed of this autumn statement, but we know that everybody likes to hold back a few surprises in terms of that announcement. But I think, we are going into an election. The Conservatives will need to save some of those sweetie election promises for the budget for next week.
Of course. Benefits crackdown next year. No, it's an interesting choice of language there. Benefits crackdown. That is very much how it is being described. How much of it is political and how much is actually fiscal?
I think, to be fair to Rishi Sunak, and we sometimes are not always, I think that he is a spreadsheet man, he is a data man, and he will be looking at what he can do to try and grow the economy. And I think that is a little bit of a driver behind this. Obviously, politically, it does look good in terms of appealing to that Tory core voter that wants to see a crackdown on benefits and people who, they may look less favourably on. But I think generally, between the two of them, and they will be looking at what actually works, what actually can help drive the economy. And if they think that some of these measures can help encourage people back to work, and that will obviously increase tax receipts for the Chancellor, give him more money to play with, I think that will form a part of their thinking too.
It's going to be interesting to see how it works. So the idea of people who fail to find work for more than 18 months having to undertake work experience placements. This is for long-term unemployed as opposed to people on incapacity benefits, people who've had the work capability assessment. It's going to be very interesting to see what that actually looks like as policy rather than proposal. I think that we will take some news. We may come back to you, Natasha. It depends on when Jeremy Hunt starts talking, but you obviously will be in situ for the rest of the afternoon with me and then with Sheila Fogarty. The time now is 12:29 and Amelia Cox has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 33 minutes after 12 and, well, look, I'm gonna be Toto for a minute. You remember the scene in The Wizard of Oz where Toto pulls back the curtain and it turns out that the great and mighty, wonderful Wizard of Oz is just some old geezer pulling buttons and pressing levers. My job for the next few minutes is just to fill the space available until Jeremy Hunt gets to his feet and starts delivering his autumn statement. But I can't let you know that. I have to present it to you as if this is deliberate and conscious broadcasting designed to illuminate you and prepare you for the imminent excitements of Jeremy Hunt's fiscal announcements. So don't, whatever you do, Look behind the curtain. Ignore the old man pressing buttons and pulling levers. LBC's political editor, Natasha Clark, is with me. Natasha, please say something.
Would you like me to talk about the autumn statement?
Oh, yes, please.
Sure. So Jeremy Hunt earlier said that there will be 110 measures in it. That's not measures of booze that chancellors usually
isn't it?
used to shot at autumn statements. That's quite a lot, actually, and we don't usually expect quite so much in an autumn statement. We usually expect to see more of the full-fat measures.
Are you going
I don't think I can.
Why not? You could just do a little tick on a piece of paper or something every time he says something.
That would take quite a lot of my time. I'd rather actually spend it listening to what he's saying. Probably not a great use of our time. Also wanted to tell you that Jeremy Hunt's wife and kids are also in the public gallery in the House of Commons to watch. Is that a sign that could be his last autumn statement? Everybody will be asking those questions, I think.
Oh, really?
Maybe he will.
So a moment of history sort of for him, and he wants his family to witness it.
That's usually the way it is. If former prime ministers and their last prime minister's questions will always have the family in to watch that last thing.
Well, so you mean that he's going to get reshuffled, or he's going to retire?
Or he's going to quit as Chancellor. He told our colleague Matthew Wright earlier on Sunday that he is going to run again as an MP and fight the next election as an MP, but I think his future as Chancellor is still a little bit uncertain. There are still people who do believe that he will step down as Chancellor before the next election. So yes, that could be his last fiscal statement before the election. I mean, obviously, I could be talking absolutely.
Hang on, let's find out. Well, anyway, here he is.
James O'Brien on LBC.